Go. All right. Yeah, I'll get right into it because I don't want to go over time. So, I'm Spencer Myers. I'm from Bowling Green State University. I'm a doctoral student in rhetoric and writing. Um, I'm focused on this presentation is focused on a short around 6 minute film called Delete Beach. It's in the anime genre and about how the body is a site of resistance. Again, what that means. In the film. So a few short disclaimers, content warnings for drug use and suicide, and that relates to the next one. This is an exploration of a representation of resistance and not an endorsement of the practices of that fictional group. And it's not a discussion over whether or not what they're doing is good praxis or not, because they do engage in using oil as a drug, and they do engage in these mass suicides as a form of resistance. Also, broadly speaking, anime as a genre is seemingly incapable of tackling issues of racism, systemic or otherwise. So just because the thing I'm looking at lacks intersectionality doesn't mean that race and gender aren't part of this, and climate change will continue to disproportionately harm Black and Indigenous people of color all over the world. And then lastly, my understanding of the post-human framework that I'm using has a lot to gain from learning more non-Western and Indigenous scholarship, so I have catching up to do. Just want to make a disclaimer about that. So how is the body a site of resistance? Academic and state-approved definitions of humanity are in an ongoing process of adapting to climate change and the Anthropocene. And that centers on the biological body is the center of that, obviously, but in something like network theory, the discursive and the collective like society language surrounding that body is where the definition of humanity comes from. So when I talk about the body being a site of resistance within the scope of this presentation, I'm talking about the ways in which a human life is defined through spaces, energy systems, and biopolitics in a contentious process between the superstructure, the base, and our larger ecology. Some quick definitions. Climate change, hopefully we're all familiar with. Planets getting warmer because of greenhouse gas emissions. I mention it to put it in comparison with the Anthropocene, which less people are familiar with. That's our current geological era in which humans have become the largest source of change on Earth. And there are negative effects that come from the Anthropocene that don't necessarily come from climate change. So climate change is flooding due to greater amounts of precipitation, whereas the Anthropocene is flooding due to more parking lots. So they're related, but there are disconnections. So our kind of global capitalist system as we know it right now has to change some elements of how it does business in order to make sure that the world stays inhabitable through climate change. But the system as we know it created the Anthropocene, so they get along just fine. Also, biopower or biopolitics, I'll be using that framework. It's a Foucauldian term for governments changing from sovereign powers like executions to liberal powers like exclusion and mass incarceration. According to Foucault, this transition has been an indispensable element of the development of capitalism as it allows the state to subjugate the bodies of its citizens under the machinery of production. And then finally, kind of tying it all together as a post-human framework, which sounds a little scary at first, but really it just means it's a framework that widens the critical lens to include the materials, objects, non-human animals, plants, and spaces that we're all embedded in and enmeshed with. This wider lens serves to decenter the human, allowing for analytical angles that can critique the systems that have come to define what humans, humanity, and human progress are in the first place. So just two quotes to position the Anthropocene and climate change next to each other. This is from Henry Lefebvre in The Production of Space, written in 1974. Natural space is disappearing. Natural space has not vanished purely and simply from the scene. It's still the background of the picture. Nature is resistant and infinite in its depth, but has been defeated and now waits only for its ultimate voidance and destruction, right? So production of space is the idea that every place that you inhabit on Earth has been produced in some way by some larger system for some means, and there's some use between the humans and that space. So that's the Anthropocene leading up to where we are now, which is climate change coming knocking on our door. So in a kind of poetic way, a metaphor for it is like the Anthropocene is putting pressure down on a spring, and then the climate change is that spring, the energy being released from it. So now this is a quote from Stacy Alimo. the recognition that human activity has altered the planet on the scale of a geological epoch muddles the commonsensical assumption that the world exists as a background for the human subject. So new materialisms, insisting on the agency and significance of matter, maintain that the substance that was once called nature acts, interacts, and interacts within, through, and around human bodies and practices. So the Anthropocene was defined by, this is civilization and this is nature. These are primitive cultures. They are beholden to nature. We're civilization. We're not beholden to nature. And there was this wall. But now that climate change is here, we're seeing that that wall was made up and that we are beholden to nature in a lot of different ways. And that pressure is coming back at us. And we're being made to redefine ourselves in relationship to the earth around us. So just a real quick Marxist reading of Delete Beach. The protagonist of Delete Beach joins what's called the Dark Sun movement, which protests the constant surveillance, heavy regulations, and propagandistic newscasts that the state uses to control and alienate them. Their protests include kind of creating this new meaning for oil where they use it as a drug, and then ultimately these mass suicides where they jump into the ocean to become oil once again. So from a Raymond Williams form of cultural criticism, the surveillance states, the superstructure, protagonists in the Dark Sun movement are the base. In the movie, the surveillance states kind of played, these cameras play the role of the surveillance state. You'll see more of them here in the next slide. So there are cameras everywhere. There are also these floating drones that are recording and projecting newscasts everywhere. These newscasts are being projected on the buildings. So the superstructure represented in Delete Beach has adapted to the demands of climate change by doubling down on its capacity to define a human being through surveillance and biopolitics. All these cameras pointed on the human body are also defining it. In being surveyed, the burners, which is what the Dark Sun movement, they call themselves burners, they're being defined and categorized by the superstructure, which defines them as lemmings and lists them as missing instead of dead. So the one newscast talks about the average life expectancy has reached 102, and then goes on to say that large amounts of people between the ages of 14 and 21 have gone missing, and that lemmings continue to jump into the ocean. So this is an example of biopolitics in that the lemmings are not factored into the math equation that was used to get that life expectancy. And you'll see this, like the debate over whether or not to include illegal immigrants in the census, is that where do they get factored into the equations that we use to define things like quality of life in America? That's how biopolitics operates, who gets sorted where and how. So humanity is within Delete Beach also defined within spatial contention. All these spaces are dominated by all this surveillance. So these are the three elements of space as outlined by Henry Lefebvre: perceived, conceived, and lived. Perceived spatial practice, how you feel like you're allowed to use a space. Conceives all the math that went into creating that space, the grid system, the golden rectangle, how all doors are the same size. And then the one I'm most interested in for the purposes of this presentation is lived space, representational spaces. That's how you have applied meaning to and correspond with a space. This is the aspect that allows you to make a house into a home and infuse meaning into a space. So astrology, ghosts, and graffiti are born here, public art. So once again, there's that picture of her, of the surveillance state, and there you can barely see her, but there's the protagonist running. She's running past surveillance. She's running towards the Dark Sun movement in this scene. So this is kind of a literal, like, spatial telling of how she's acting as an individual. She's leaving the dominated space and entering kind of an outside space of resistance. So just as lived space overlays physical space, making symbolic uses of its objects, the Dark Sun movement uses the waste of oil as a symbol against the empires that grow rich from it. So the protagonist likens this waste of oil like to waking a drunk in an abattoir. That's below is a poem that the Dark Sun movement has painted on a wall in oil. So David, on the right is a quote from David Harvey. He's kind of the modern torchbearer of Henry Lefebvre, and he sees the city as a process. So applying these this meaning onto a public space like this, applying your lived meaning onto it, is being part of the process of the city. So one outcome that we may find ourselves stuck for a very long time with a particular kind of social process. As long as the process of the city is going on, we might get stuck with these top-down parts of our social process applied by the superstructure. An example would be nuclear power. Once nuclear power stations exist, all sorts of things follow. If a nuclear power station goes on the blink, can you imagine calling a town meeting to discuss democratically what to do about it? Not really. So a thing has been created which for as long as it lasts is by its very nature going to be basically undemocratic in terms of the sort of social process that supports it. So that's to lead into the other element of space that's being contested is the energy system that you exist in, which I did not expect there to be such a ripped from the headlines location for this. But what's happening in Texas right now is this, they decided to be on a statewide grid system instead of being on a national system. So this kind of Texas individuality that politicians like to espouse has been worked into and kind of expressed through the energy system. And now it's led to this crisis, this very specific kind of crisis. So governments looking to switch to clean energy programs are using sociospatial frameworks. They're familiar with them. One example is the TPSN, Territory, Place, Scale Network. It's used to understand dynamic interrelationships between people and their energy systems. Out of these four, the one I'm most interested in is place. This is where kind of locals are able to exert their maximum amount of power, where we're able to do placemaking and decide what kind of space we want to live in. But placemaking can be applied top down. So on the bottom left, there's a screenshot of a surveillance drone in Duluth Beach, and the End of Oil Gala celebrating the anniversary of the Planetary Carbon Free Council is being cast out by this newscast drone. So it's talking about this event that it's for the public to celebrate the current energy system that they have. That's an example of kind of dispersing an energy system culturally, and making it a part of the socio-spatial process. So between being sorted out by biopolitics, being spatially dominated by surveillance, and having an energy system applied top-down onto them, the Dark Sun movement is marginalized, or maybe a little self-marginalized. That's in question. It's only a 6-minute movie, so some specifics aren't quite worked out, but they seek power from that marginalized position. And I'm using a definition of marginality provided by Bell Hooks. Marginality is the site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. It was this marginality that I was naming as a central location for the production of a counter-hegemonic discourse that is not just found in words, but in habits of being and the way one lives. So we've talked a lot about how Dark Sun movement is building their own meaning for oil. That's part of the habits of being. It nourishes one's capacity to resist. It offers to one the possibility of radical perspective from which to see and create, to imagine alternatives, new worlds. So kind of parallel and new alternative worlds will also be a repeated theme that will come back. So yeah, from this marginalized space, they're creating this new meaning for oil, this new personal meaning that isn't state run, and they're giving characteristics to it as a material. So when the corporations and governments or addicts get a habit and outdo them, they're saying that they're, as opposed to the billboard of the natural gas well powering America, they're seeing it as an addiction, and they're trying to embody that addiction. So they engage in self-marginalization through copying the state's material habits as opposed to cultural habits. By emulating the state's addiction to exploitation and resources, they attach personally crafted meanings to oil. So I think this is important and an interesting message, because people on the receiving end of climate change often have a different relationship with fossil fuels compared to the people causing it. The CEO of Shell has a different relation to oil. We do. I've had the chance to go to energy conferences, and people who work in the coal industry or work in these industries, they see like coal as a magic rock, like it means a lot to them. And of course it would. If they've been working for 40 plus years on how to get as much energy out of this rock as possible, it's going to mean more and more to them. And I noticed car culture. I'm interested in exploring that from a lot of elements, but I think how car culture interacts with the materiality of oil as a very specific kind of meaning making as well. So post-human determinism. So by focusing on becoming a material, Delete Beach is part of a larger ecology of critiques, post-human and otherwise, that question decenter the Western Eurocentric definition of self-determination and intentional humanity, that the progress of the Anthropocene was kind of inevitable, and this is the way things are supposed to be, which Marxism calls into question as well, especially in regards to kind of the people saying that capitalism is the natural form of government. But the geologic timescale of post-humanism decenters short-sighted thinking, which includes capitalism, and the Marxist critique, which tends to be also human-centric. So on the right, there's more of this meaning making with the material. Become oil to understand its unsparing, willful need, its ability to control. So they're applying these personality traits to oil and creating this relationship with it that's their own. This is a great quote from Raisi Grodati. A more adequate self-understanding emerges once it has become clear that nobody is actually in charge of the course of historical progress. So thanks to feminist and post-colonial analyses, we have come to regard the human standard that was posited in the universal mode of man of reason as inadequate precisely because of its partiality. So I include that full quote to note just to kind of come back to my discipline and being in the humanities. So much of the humanities is steeped in this man of reason idea that has just gone through from Socrates to Descartes and very Eurocentric has worked its way up into a lot of the ways we've been taught. So decentering that idea of what a human being is, I think climate change and the Anthropocene offers a unique position from which to decenter that idea of man. So Delete Beach is part of a larger kind of canon of anime films and shows that I think offer very unique perspectives on the Anthropocene and climate change. The transition into a material that is in Delete Beach is part of a tradition of anime's post-human stories that capture an intimate apocalypse, is a great way of putting it. So in Akira, there's Tetsuo and Kaneda. Tetsuo's disembodied voice at the end pretends a post-human existence. Before he becomes disembodied, he becomes this huge amorphous blob of a thing that can be considered post-human. Ghost in the Shell, Motoko Kusanagi, the protagonist from the get-go is an android. She's post-human. But by the end of the film, as you can see in the picture, she is just a head. So she's completely cast off the human shape even. And then Neon Genesis Evangelion, if you've seen it, Shinji plays a part in bringing about the Human Instrumentality Project, which combines all consciousnesses into this giant orange goo. It's great. So here's a quote from Susan Napier that I think resonates. Ghost in the Shell's director Mamoru Oshii states that the net, so by the end of Ghost in the Shell, the protagonist is battling the antagonist in this virtual space. So the net can be equated with the myriad gods of the Shinto religion, underlining the notion that Kusanagi's fusion with the puppet master has strongly theological overtones. I might also suggest that the notion of a bodiless union with an amorphous greater entity has clear evocations of the Buddhist concept of nirvana, where the self is said to become like a single drop in a vast ocean. So that end part specifically with Delete Beach, they're literally jumping in the ocean. They're literally becoming part of what's at the bottom of the ocean, the oil down there. So Delete Beach puts itself parallel and expresses its post-humanity differently than a lot of anime. A lot of anime uses technological mediation to achieve post-humanity, science experiments and becoming an android and mecha and stuff like that. And sometimes that's used to critique fascism and eugenics. But I think keeping it within an ecological post-human framework allows it to focus on global capitalism and biopolitics. And the action is done as a form of opposition as opposed to salvation. So it eschews kind of the standard eschatological rant you can sometimes get in anime, especially from the antagonists. So 2 minutes. By the end of Delete Beach, it's also critiqued post-human frameworks in a way. So the protagonist goes to jump with the dark sun movement. They need to jump at a specific time in order to hit the tides to be washed out. But she doesn't make that time because she hesitates, because she ties her dog up and her dog's barking, and she decides to hesitate, go back and say goodbye. And that connection with her domesticated animal is what stops her from becoming oil. So that's in line with earlier in the film. We learned that her grandmother also, it's called failed to launch, failed to become oil, when she noticed that a comrade had a baby strapped to her chest and decided to save and raise that baby, and that baby is the protagonist. So this resonates with the idea that post-humanism can be a tough frame to adopt, not just because of state control or persistent Eurocentric definitions, but because there are meanings and relationships that we make and kind of how we define ourselves that are stickier to contend with, like having pets, which elevates certain non-human animals above others, and the preservation of our species, which is kind of hardwired into us, which elevates humans above the rest. So to have a truly post-human, open, radically open way of thinking, these become sticky and worth exploring. So just two conclusions. Although the Anthropocene and climate change challenge humanity's intentionality and our centrality, I would argue, concepts like geologic time, the timescale of the Earth, may be more difficult to integrate into our everyday life, while concepts like pet ownership and procreation most likely won't lose meaning. And the ongoing back and forth process of both the base and superstructure defining humanity will continue, but climate change in this current moment in time offers a unique moment in history to question how our past and present definitions of what it means to be human have led us to this point, and where they're going to lead us into the future. And that's it.